Welcome to the Thinking in Between podcast, where we explore the borderlands of health and social science. Each week, we invite a guest to tell us 3 big ideas that have most influenced their research and thinking. I'm Stephen Hibbs, a doctoral research fellow at Queen Mary University of London, and today I'm joined by Esca van Blarikom, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Cornell University in New York State. Esca, it's brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me, Stephen.
I guess to start with, would you mind saying a little bit about your journey so far as a researcher and what you've been studying so far?
Yeah, sure. So I'm trained as a medical anthropologist, or that is what I did my master's in. And I did my PhD at Queen Mary, so I was part of the Apollo Social Science group, which you obviously are also part of. And my PhD was exploring the experiences of working-age adults who live in East London with multiple health conditions. So I looked into their experiences navigating care services, and I was really interested in the kind of combination of long-term illness where people have a mental as well as a physical symptom or a combination of those symptoms.
And you recently moved to New York, and just to say a little bit about what is it that you're working on now?
Yeah, so I just started my first postdoctoral role in July, so I've only been here for a few weeks now. But my current project is not so much a research project as a project that aims to bring scholars together. So it's only 1 year, and what the aim of the project is to organize a series of workshops in different places across the world. So there's already been one in Salerno in Italy, and we'll organize one in Delhi in India, and then in Ithaca, New York as well. And the aim of the project is to bring together biopolitical scholars with anthropological scholars to reflect on the notion of global health after the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way that concept has also been transformed by the event of the pandemic and kind of in the landscape post-pandemic. But I guess I can also talk about that a bit later, because one of the concepts that we'll be discussing is biopolitics, so that will hopefully become a bit clearer then.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the first idea that you've brought today to tell us about is a book, and it's the book Death Without Weeping by Nancy Scheper Hughes. It's a book that I've often seen kind of written as like a real classic, I think, in anthropology. And I wonder if you could tell us to start with a bit about what the book's about, and then how it spoke to you and influenced your research journey.
Yeah, sure. So I guess this is not so much kind of a big idea, it's more just kind of a book that really impressed me, and it kind of always stayed with me and also introduced me to the idea of an ethnographic monograph. Because the first degree that I obtained was not medical anthropology as such, but cultural anthropology. And ethnographic monographs are really kind of the stuff of cultural anthropology, I suppose. And so as you say, it's a classic. It's a book that I was introduced to in my first year as an anthropology student. And I was 19 years old, and I read it, and I was kind of blown away both by the level of thinking and the kind of concepts and ideas that it introduced me to in a really accessible way. So by talking about fieldwork and fieldwork experiences instead of talking about theory head-on. And I was also really impressed by the beauty of it. So Nancy Scheper Hughes is a really prolific writer, and there's a kind of attention for detail and an attention for language that I wasn't expecting to encounter in a kind of academic book. So it really kind of convinced me when I was reading it that I was in the right place, because I encountered something that I found so beautiful in a kind of academic context, and that was surprising and wonderful.
Could you say a bit more about the role of, I guess, beautiful writing, or like what it means, like what's the relationship between writing beautifully and evocatively and compellingly like that to the research method of ethnography?
Yeah, so writing is essential to ethnography, and it's kind of unique to anthropology in some ways, although philosophical writing can be beautiful as well. But the difference, I guess, is that the method of ethnography is to immerse yourself in the everyday. It's anthropology literally means the study of what it means to be human. But I think the kind of difference between anthropology and, for example, psychology or sociology is that it has this focus on encounters in the everyday. So writing is a way of evoking all those kind of elements of being immersed in a situation. So the smells, the sounds, the kind of feeling that you get when you encounter something new or when you arrive in a new setting that you're not completely familiar with, and the kind of transformation that you go through as you become more familiar or as you become socialized in that situation, is a kind of way of introducing the reader to something that's foreign and other to them, and kind of making it familiar, and then vice versa as well, making the familiar and the everyday kind of other and foreign in order to understand it anew, or in order to appreciate it in a new way. And Death Without Weeping is a good example of that, because it tackles the concept of motherhood, so something that we're all very familiar with and something that's very intimate to the human experience across the world, so something that's universal in that sense. But it makes it other through a very thick description of I guess, a puzzling experience of motherhood that Nancy Shepherd Hughes was confronted with.
Could you give us an example of perhaps part of the book that stuck with you as an example of that, of making one think differently about motherhood?
Yeah, so it's immediately what comes to mind is the opening of the book. So the book was published in 1992 after a period of fieldwork that Shepherd Hughes conducted in a shanty town in northeast of Brazil. But she encountered this community much earlier. So in the 60s, I think, she was a volunteer in the Peace Corps. And she went to this shanty town in Brazil as a very young person. She was not trained in anthropology. And she went there to help out with kind of public health related matters. So she had this kind of specific focus on maternal health and child health. And she was distributing medicines and kind of, I guess, educating people about public health strategies, which she also reflects on quite critically in the book. But anyway, one of the experiences that she has as a volunteer is that she assisted a mother in giving birth. And the baby was born, and it was clearly kind of weak. It was kind of struggling, and she noticed that something was wrong. So she brought the baby to a health care service a bit further away from the village on her own. The mother did not accompany her because she had just given birth at home. And the baby died in that place. So Nancy Shepherd Hughes, a really young girl, had to kind of walk back to that village, holding the infant's corpse to return it to the mother, which is obviously a very difficult thing to do. And she was crying all the way on her way back to the house, wondering how she was going to tell the mother of what had happened, and just feeling horrible. And when she came to the place, there was a mother there and a lot of other kind of women from the family and from the neighborhood who had gathered there, and they were kind of making fun of the fact that Nancy Shepherd Hughes was crying. They were saying, like, "What are you so upset about? This is only a little baby. It's nothing to worry about, such as life. Things happen." And Nancy Shepherd Hughes was kind of shocked by this. Like, how can you not be affected? Or how can you not be shocked by the death of a little infant? What does this say about the concept of motherhood in this social and cultural setting? So I guess one kind of way of answering that question would be to say that motherhood is simply culturally different in that shanty town of Brazil, that kind of the effects or the kind of maternal bonds that are developed there are fundamentally different. But Shepherd Hughes kind of refused that answer. And instead she takes a kind of more, I guess, militant position and argues that it's the kind of conditions of poverty and of political constraint and social constraint and a scarcity of resources that means that mothers, as a way of protecting themselves, do not develop a bond with an infant until they know that the infant is strong enough to survive, because they lose a lot of their children. They often get a lot of children because there's not enough. There was not enough kind of sexual protection at that time, so they had quite a large number of children, and almost half of their children would die before reaching a certain age because they just didn't have enough kind of just food to go around, or they didn't have enough access to medicine. So the conditions in which they were able to rear their children didn't allow them to kind of let maternal bonds to flourish before they were certain that an infant would be strong enough to survive. And so that's a kind of answer that Shepard Hughes formulates to a very ancient debate in anthropology between universalism and cultural relativism, which is that should you kind of accept the variances that exist between cultures and how they approach certain things, or when you're confronted with something that's clearly an instance of suffering, or that's clearly an instance of kind of constraint that's preventable, should you maybe take a more kind of militant stance and also advocate for change, or kind of use that as an opportunity to also argue against some of the kind of more constraining or repressing conditions that people find themselves living in. And that's a discussion that's still kind of very ongoing today in anthropology about the kind of ethical stance that you're supposed to take as a researcher to the situations that you find in the field. And I found that a kind of very and a kind of answer and a kind of ethical position that she took on that really inspired me and that made a lot of sense to me, I suppose.
And I wonder, did any of that sort of debate or the sort of taking of a stance, were you confronted with that during your ethnographic work amongst working age adults with multiple medical conditions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing that you're constantly confronted with when you're conducting field work. And I'm actually reminded now not so much of that study, although it happened there as well, but of the kind of first project that I did as a medical anthropology student, which was about motherhood, perhaps not surprisingly, and it was about the way that Dutch care services were developing a tool to evaluate vulnerability during pregnancy. And they were kind of basing that tool on big data. So they would ask mothers all these questions, and then based on their answers, give them a certain score. And if that score was higher than a certain number, then they would be considered vulnerable, and they would need to be referred for extra care, or there would be kind of additional services that would be consulted about that mother. So there's these, again, in that tool, you can see that there's this kind of universal idea of what motherhood is supposed to be. So if you're a single mother, or if you live in a certain neighborhood, or if you don't have a job, or if you have had a history of drug dependency, then that might mean that makes you more vulnerable as a mother. But at the same time, taking such a universal approach kind of means that you lose sight of the political and social conditions, which kind of make it harder to enact motherhood, I suppose. So it puts the blame on the individual woman themselves for the kind of conditions that they find themselves in. Whereas you could also kind of look at why birth outcomes are worse in a certain neighborhood, and why, for example, women of a certain ethnicity have worse birth outcomes. It could also be related to the racism that they encounter in the healthcare system, as well as in kind of conditions of employment in society. So it's kind of about where you choose to focus your analysis on, I suppose. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my very early encounters with anthropology and just the problematizing of talking about cultural factors just in and of itself, I remember being really unsettling, but in a good way, of kind of, I guess, situations that, like the one you described in the opening of the book by Nancy Shepard Hughes, where, the conclusion of, aren't cultures different from each other, or something like that actually can mystify, can kind of almost purposefully distract from something where there is a responsibility to act, and there's an issue of justice. And I think I'm always, since kind of come across that, trying to be a bit suspicious of whenever the word cultural is used, particularly in sort of medical contexts and things where you sort of at least want to ask the question of, what's the history behind that? What's under the bonnet there?
Yeah, precisely. And I think also, for example, a concept such as lifestyle is in a way a kind of individual version of such a concept as culture, because I think in the kind of context of my research on people with chronic illness, and that kind of relates, I think, to the work that you've been doing with people with sickle cell, there's sometimes a tendency to blame people for not getting better or for not managing their conditions well enough with kind of referring to lifestyle or to kind of referring to diet, or that's just a characteristic of that person. They're not taking care well enough of themselves. Whereas you can also kind of take a step back and kind of look at why a person is living, I mean, it's kind of problematizing the notion of choice, I suppose, that you have as a person making certain decisions. Because I think, in lifestyle, I think that concept of choice is a bit obscured, I suppose.
Great, thank you. So I think the second idea you're bringing today is one that I had not come across at all until reading your work and speaking with you about it. But it's Lacan, who brings a concept of extimacy. So I think this is definitely one where we're going to need to start with some sort of definition or an introduction to what extimacy means, because I imagine a lot of listeners like me won't be familiar with this. So if you could explain a bit about what the concept is to start with, and then tell us a bit about what it's allowed you to see during the course of your research.
Yeah, so Jacques Lacan is a kind of notoriously difficult writer. His texts are very obscure almost and very hard to read. And I think if anyone is listening to this who's kind of trained a little bit in psychoanalysis or knows Jacques Lacan, they will think that I'm kind of probably butchering the concept in the way that I'll explain it now, but that's okay. So I think the easiest way to explain it is to talk a bit about the way that I've applied it in my research, because I think it will make more sense. So when I started my PhD, I started working with Deborah Swinglehurst and Nina Fudge at Queen Mary, who both kind of have this attention on biography and on biographical research. And for me, that was kind of a switch, because I think there is a tendency in anthropology as well to gather life stories and to kind of have these interviews, but the focus on biography is often a bit more in the background. So there's more a focus on practices or, I guess, descriptions of encounters. But in my PhD, I kind of became quite interested in doing biographical research, and I conducted biographical interviews as part of my ethnographic study as well. And I became very interested in the concept of subjectivity. So in the question of, when you're living in a certain social or cultural context, what kind of subject positions are you allowed to have? So what kind of subject positions can kind of emerge from that situation? So I think that in researching people who live with multiple long-term conditions, I noticed that there's a kind of identity of chronicity that people develop or take on, that of course has variations between individuals, but there is this kind of common experience there in what people are thinking and feeling and the stance that they take vis-a-vis the outside world and the way that they're expressing their experiences as well. So obviously in their encounters with the healthcare system, there were some elements, or with the external world as well, there were some elements that were kind of creating this identity of a kind of specific subject position as someone who had chronic illnesses. And Jacques Lacan, I mean, I'm also thinking now about, I guess, the interview that you did with Deborah earlier on in this podcast, where she talked about Bakhtinian theory. I mean, it's this kind of specific approach to language where you're not taking speech or the things that people are saying as a kind of truth or as a kind of direct expression of their innermost selves. So in that sense, an interview itself, or the kind of responses that you get from people on questions, they are not a kind of gateway to subjectivity as such. So you require a sort of different level of analysis in order to get at subjectivity. And Deborah kind of explained this by referring to Bakhtin, who calls speech dialogical. So he argues that people import different discourses or voices or different narratives that they weave into their speech. So, for example, by using parody, they can import a voice, an authoritative voice of someone else that they want to undermine. Or they might kind of parrot a narrative that they've learned from a mother or from an healthcare provider or from a politician, someone who has influenced them. And in that sense, every time we speak, our voices contain multiple voices, kind of contain imported voices from the external world. And I think the extimacy is a concept that you can see that's working along these same lines. So it takes a kind of similar position towards language, but it in some ways goes maybe a bit further or approaches it a bit differently, in the sense that so Lacan has this kind of model for subjectivity. I'm sorry if it becomes a bit complex here, but I'll try to kind of take it slow. He has this kind of model of subjectivity that's a topological model. So he proposes a structure for subjectivity in the form of a Möbius strip. So this is a topological model by which he tries to get away from a very common way of defining subjectivity in philosophy and in psychology as well, which is a sphere. So often in kind of psychology and in phenomenology as well, the subject is kind of envisioned as being in the center of a sphere and surrounded by an environment, or what someone sometimes called an Umwelt. And in that sense, you have someone in the middle, kind of an individual who's constantly being impacted by their environment and impacting their environment, vice versa. But for Lacan, that doesn't really work, because you are kind of envisioning still an inside and an outside. And it's a bit too black and white or unnuanced for him. So he proposes the image of the Möbius strip instead to think about subjectivity. And I would kind of advise anyone who's listening to this to maybe just Google the Möbius strip on Google Images to get an impression of it. But it's a surface. If you imagine having a strip of paper and you glue both ends of it together, but before you do that, you introduce a twist. So you have a kind of 8 shape, and it's a continuous surface. So if you trace this surface with your finger, and again, if you Google this image, you can kind of imagine this a bit better. But if you trace the surface of the Möbius strip, you can kind of cover all of it without ever having to lift your finger. So you're moving from the inside to the outside of the surface unnoticedly. There's never a cut or a rupture. And that is, for Lacan, the best way of kind of representing subjectivity. So there's no kind of real distinction between inside and outside, because as human beings, we can only know ourselves through language. And language is something that we've learned from the external world. So we're given concepts in order to think about the world that are coming from our culture, that we've learned from our parents, from our teachers, and so on. So if I'm to introduce myself to you or to describe myself to you, I might say, I'm Esca, I'm an anthropologist, or maybe if it's a more personal conversation, I could say I'm a woman, I'm Belgian, I'm white. I mean, there's all these kind of words that I can use to describe myself that I've learned and that we've learned the meaning of as we were growing up, but that might come close to the kind of experience that we have of our own bodies and our own situations, but that can never fully cover it. So there's always this kind of disharmony between language and our experiences. And I find this a really interesting theory, but it really started to matter for me while I was kind of researching chronic illness and people's experiences with the care system, because obviously what happens when you go to a doctor is that you describe an experience, something that you're feeling, a symptom or a kind of event, a kind of experience of suffering, and that you're handed a certain concept in order to make sense of it. And that also will help you to manage it, because it will open up a certain pathway to care. It will help you to use that concept to explain to your loved ones, to your employer, what's going on with you. It will legitimize your suffering in a certain way. But it can also obscure some of your kind of lived experiences, I suppose, because it illuminates certain things about your experience and pushes away or marginalizes certain other things. So if you're using the word diabetic or depressed or even chronic to describe your experiences, then that shapes your identity in a certain way. And I guess the concept of extimacy describes how it does that, because it describes something that's become really intimate and internal, but that you've acquired from the outside. So it's something that introduces a cut or a rupture with regards to how you can experience yourself, but that kind of lodges itself within your most intimate understanding of yourself. So it's kind of an external intimacy. So that's what Lacan calls extimacy. So that's a kind of way of understanding how our identity is kind of made up out of things that we learn, that we import, and that become really essential to the way that we understand ourselves, become really essential to our own identities. And it becomes even more complicated when you realize that even the idea of having an immediate kind of pre-linguistic access to your own body, kind of a lived experience of suffering before, for example, you were handed a diagnosis, that even that concept is only something that you can get at through language. So that is what Lacan calls kind of the experience of the real, opens up only in the kind of domain of the symbolic. So there is no such thing as a kind of unmediated access to our body. So that's why we need diagnoses. We need kind of language and words to help us make sense of our experiences and to be able to communicate with others. But at the same time, we need to be really careful of how these function. So again, if you have this kind of concept of chronicity and that becomes part of your identity, then what does that do with your kind of expectations of the future? It kind of implies that your suffering won't change, that you have no hope of getting better, that your experience is chronic. So I've kind of argued during my PhD that perhaps that term of chronicity is not a very helpful one in the healthcare system. So that's kind of one example of how language becomes really important, I guess, for the act of diagnosing, obviously, but I think for anyone's experiences with care services or with any kind of categorizing instances. I mean, that's any kind of bureaucratic system that we're engaging with as members of society. So sorry, that's a very long-winded answer, but I hope it kind of made sense.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you. And I guess it just, there's so much there. But I guess even just that thought that, I guess, the best we can do is sort of tinker with the tools we've got in language rather than believing that there is this kind of unadulterated true, this is what we really, really, really are experiencing and want to say, that doesn't get kind of sullied and constrained by whatever concept we got at the time. It's always going to be imperfect. It's just the imperfections are different depending on which ones we choose. And I guess also the goodness of fit, if I can put it that way, of the language we use, I guess is quite variable across different people it's applied to. So for some people that might do more useful work in expressing their subjectivity, and others, particularly like those who you're describing in your research, it might not do the work that could be done, that could allow different possibilities. But I guess it's, what comes through to me is like it's thinking about possibilities of what could be different rather than trying to get to the sort of pure unadulterated truth.
Yeah, and it's also about asking yourself what the diagnosis does, right? Rather than is it covering the truth. But because I guess one of the things that Lacan also stresses is that this idea that you can ever have a concept or a kind of form of language that completely covers your experiences or that completely falls together with the truth is very dangerous, because what we see happening in healthcare today is precisely that. It's that healthcare is becoming so fragmented. Like, we have all these different categories for mental health problems. We have all these different kind of types of chronic illness. We have pre-diabetes, diabetes type 1, diabetes type 2. We have different forms of hypertension. We have, you can kind of think about this in mental health as well. We have kind of all these different types of ADHD. So kind of all the care services are becoming very, very specialized. And they're kind of... I guess I want to use the word flourishing, but not in a good way, but in a bad way. They're kind of getting out of control.
Yes.
It's kind of, you have all these different specializations, which means that the body in itself and different experiences are also becoming more fragmentized, and that the healthcare system is having to kind of also carry these different specializations as a system, which means that you need more people who are trained in different specializations. You need nurses for these specific categories. You need different kind of departments for that. Whereas, it kind of, makes it difficult to take a holistic approach to the body, I suppose. So Lacan, there's a lot to say about this. It's a very difficult discussion to have, I think, nowadays. But he only uses 3 categories for diagnosis in mental health, which is hysteria, perversion, and psychosis. I mean, that's very old-fashioned, but he kind of really hangs on to these concepts and doesn't want to kind of change them or specify them, because he says that you will never kind of be able to cover all the experiences that people will bring to a healthcare setting. So perhaps you just have to learn to work with these imperfect concepts and kind of see what you can do with them and use them as a tool and not as something that kind of can completely define someone's identity. If you kind of assume upfront that it's just a kind of mode of being in the world or a mode of thinking, like a kind of different kind of discourses that you can get stuck in, rather than something that completely covers or will completely fall together with your experiences of yourself, then you also don't have this need. Then you can kind of be more flexible, I suppose, with how you apply these concepts in practice.
I can ask you one more question as well, just right at the start of you explaining about how you first came across this. You spoke about using a focus on narratives in your work, whereas before it had been more focused on practices and structures, I think you said. I just wonder, because that's quite an interesting juxtaposition, I guess, of what really focusing in on one person's individual biography allows you to see and do compared to, I guess, stepping back and looking at something that kind of goes beyond what one person, perhaps a sort of broader field. Would you be able to say a bit more about what that attention to narrative allowed you to see differently in your research?
I suppose, especially within chronic illness and anthropology, there's kind of the kind of main theorists at the moment are kind of what sometimes referred to as material semiotics. So that's kind of Anne-Marie Moll's work and Janet Pols's work, which is very focused on practices. And I think it's been really useful approach to chronic illness, because it's kind of revealed the multiplicity of what illness is, I suppose. So they kind of pointed towards how a disease is enacted differently in the lab compared to in a GP's office, compared to when someone is managing their disease at home, which is an idea that I really like, and I've worked with a lot myself as well for my research. But I think one thing that is sometimes kind of missed in that is precisely the attention for a person's biography. So what you do end up with is a kind of the patient that emerges in those kind of studies is kind of devoid of certain characteristics. So you're not really taking into account the way that that person has grown up, or the kind of specific language that person is used to referring to their own experiences. You're kind of not taking into account so much the kind of neighborhood that they grew up in, or the kind of specifics of their story, I suppose. So what I've tried to do a little bit, and that was kind of also, coming from being trained in the University of Amsterdam, where this theory by Anne-Marie Moll is very kind of dominant, and which really inspired me to then moving to work with Deborah and Nina, who had this biographical approach, to kind of marry these two perspectives, to kind of try to try to observe care practices with that kind of, by being able to kind of frame it within that wider life story of that patient. So through that was the first thing that I did in my PhD, was before I observed any kind of encounters in healthcare services or visited anyone at home to observe their self-care practices, was to conduct 2 very in-depth biographical interviews to learn about how their symptoms emerged, like what came first, in what kind of words do you describe your experiences, how have you when did you encounter a healthcare provider for the first time, and what was the first diagnosis that you got, and how did you feel about it? Those kind of things were something that I was really curious about, to also see how it impacts practices, or kind of how people import their life experiences or bring them along when they come to healthcare encounters, for example, or so I guess to give a bit more history to the practices that you observe, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think just in you telling that makes me think, there is a different relationship with time, isn't there? When you're focusing on individual biographies, it stretches back much further than that. The observation, which can be really rich, but you don't really know what was happening even 5 minutes before you come to observe. and let alone 40 years or whatever it might be. So thank you. No, that's really helpful. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this concept or this I guess focus on narratives alongside practices before we move on to your third point?
I mean, no, I think, like I said, it's a really difficult author, and it's very theoretical, kind of the concepts that he uses, and it's a very difficult writer to get into. So I'm not sure if I kind of covered it very well, but I hope it somehow made sense. But yeah, I think he has this kind of whole own philosophy of language, and it's, I think, not something that we want to get into now because it will take us too far. But yeah, I hope it kind of, that you could follow me somehow.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I think the final idea that we're going to look at today is one from Foucault, which is the concept of biopolitics, which I think, unlike extimacy, is probably a word that many listeners will have at least come across, whether or not they have used it or have used Foucault's work directly. But perhaps just to start with, do you mind explaining a bit about what this concept is, what biopolitics is, and then to talk a bit about what it's allowed you to do in your research?
Yeah, so Foucault in general and this idea of biopolitics specifically has had a major impact across the social sciences, and not surprisingly very much so in medical anthropology as well. It's not a very easy concept also because it's popped up in different kind of transformations throughout Foucault's work. It kind of comes, he uses it for the first time in the first history of sexuality that he wrote, and then he kind of continues to use it quite towards the end of his life as well, when he starts to give lectures at the Collège de France, and he has this whole kind of lecture series on the birth of biopolitics as well. And there's kind of different levels in which you can use this concept, but I suppose the first kind of, not exactly definition that he gives to it, but the first way that he uses it in the first history of sexuality is as a way to kind of characterize what he sees as a fundamental shift in modern kind of Western techno-scientific societies as they move from having a structure of a sovereign power to kind of more democratic kind of power structure, I suppose, or kind of way of governance, where there's also like less authority coming from the church and from a sovereign such as a king, and more authority coming from science and from knowledge, I suppose, or from scientifically based knowledge. And what it denotes is that life itself, very much in the biological sense actually, has become the object of politics in a way that it hadn't been before. And a good example of that is the emergence of population health sciences, for example, where statistics comes to play a very important role. So what you see kind of emerging is the science of counting people and counting bodies, and trying to discern patterns in populations of at what age are people dying, for example, or how much infant mortality do we have in a certain population, or how many women die during pregnancy in a certain population, and what can we do to improve that. And that's a kind of new way of governance for Foucault that's very kind of, I guess, tied up also with Western societies and with kind of, the science of statistics and the science of medicine, biomedicine, where for the first time life itself and the amelioration of population health becomes an object for politics, and becomes also a new kind of domain for, well, on the one hand, in a positive sense, amelioration. So you see kind of hygienic circumstances in hospitals becoming better, life conditions for people improving, but it also becomes a domain of power. So you see the rise of institutions such as hospitals, psychiatries, also prisons. Pedagogy becomes a thing. So how do you best rear a child so that it can become a kind of healthy and productive member of society in this specific way? That all kind of emerges in that context. And so in the kind of study of health and illness, this concept becomes quite important to work with, because it provides a lens on thinking about what is considered normal and abnormal in a certain society, what is a domain of intervention, and how is also some kind of more coercive forces or controlling forces or measures, how are they also justified by pointing towards population health, for example. Yeah.
Right. Like an example of one of those coercive forces. Could you just give us one?
Obviously, Foucault has one of his very famous examples is the prison system, where you can kind of, instead of having a sovereign where if someone steals, for example, you cut off their hand, and then it's a very good example for the neighbors, and you can kind of get on with life after that. What you do instead is you remove a person who is considered to be deviant in some ways from the rest of society. You kind of take them away, and you try to change them through disciplining procedures. So instead of just making an example out of that person or assuming that it was kind of a once-off, you kind of see that as a deviant form of behavior in society, and you try to improve that so that coming generations will be better, or that we can move towards a kind of better version of society. And in psychiatry, you can kind of see that happening as well. I mean, Foucault had a huge impact on how kind of coercive and constraining psychiatric hospitals were. They had a very almost punitive mechanism in the way that they treated patients. And I think Foucault's analysis of those institutions had a huge influence on breaking down some of those institutions as well. I mean, for better or for worse, because sometimes the way that it's being handled now in communities is also not working, since, for example, the NHS is not investing enough in communities to allow them to support patients as a kind of way of making up for the breakdown of institutions. But that's another story. But he kind of, I think he kind of really illuminated the kind of coercive stuff that was going on in these institutions. So prisons, hospitals, schools, armies, and so on.
So using this idea of biopolitics and kind of what it foregrounds, how does that change how we can then conduct health research, or just kind of come at a particular condition or a particular question in health?
So maybe it helps if I talk a little bit about the new project that I'm working on, because you can kind of see how it functions in that context. So as I said at the beginning, this project kind of aims to bring together anthropological scholars and then scholars who are a bit more from, I guess, a philosophical background and who are working with Foucault in a more theoretical sense. So using that concept of biopolitics in order to analyze events, political shifts, analyze the world, basically. So this project is about the COVID-19 pandemic and about the notion of global health. And global health is a concept that's been really central in the way that biopolitics is being enacted in the past decades, I suppose. So what we often see happening, for example, is that comparisons are being made between levels of illness between two countries. Like a really good example, actually, is again that study that I did as a medical anthropology student about maternal health and vulnerability during pregnancy. I was conducting research in a hospital in Rotterdam, and there's this one neighborhood of Rotterdam that's considered kind of, I guess, socially disadvantaged or problematic. And what you can see is that it has birth outcomes and health outcomes for children that are way lower than the kind of Dutch standard, I suppose. And one thing that was often said about this neighborhood was that it had the same level of birth outcomes as Mali, a country in Africa. And it was kind of used, these statistics were kind of used as a way of saying, like, this is not the standard of care that we want to, or this kind of standard of outcomes that we want to have in the Netherlands. We are kind of used to a different level of success, I suppose, kind of different level of pregnancy outcomes. It's shocking to imagine that there's a neighborhood in Rotterdam that has similar maternal health outcomes as a country in Africa, as Mali, for example, which is in itself a kind of, I mean, there's a lot to say about that. You can kind of analyze that kind of discourse in many ways, but that's a kind of biopolitical discourse, because you're taking these kind of scientific facts, you're taking statistics to make an argument about about the care system, for example, and to justify a new intervention, to justify also something that does introduce a new level of control, I suppose. And I mean, in global health, I mean, there was this idea, I think, pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, that there was a kind of that we had quite strong institutions of global health that were, for example, really investing in pandemic preparedness, that were kind of really investing in global cooperation and solidarity. But then the pandemic happened, and the first thing that occurred was that all the countries around the world kind of reverted to national measures. There was very little global cooperation. As soon as vaccines were being developed, there was this kind of race to hug them for your own country. And still, I mean, there's very little equal distribution of vaccines. But what you also saw happening was that even national governments really didn't know what to do with the pandemic at all. There's this kind of idea, I suppose, that biopolitics is a very rational approach to governance. But this idea was kind of shattered by the COVID-19 pandemic, because the responses that governments had to the pandemic were not at all rational. They were kind of going for measures that were not backed by science at all, and that they kind of reverted to in a kind of almost panic reaction. So there's this question, I guess, among philosophers and among anthropologists as well, of how can we still think about global health, and how can we still think about kind of the rationality of biopolitics on that scale after the pandemic, which has revealed to us so much that of our assumptions that, about this kind of form of governance that just kind of completely collapsed under this stress of this unforeseen pandemic. So how can we reflect on that? And it's really interesting that anthropologists are brought into this conversation because biopolitics is such a kind of Western-focused concept as well. So we're inviting people who are doing fieldwork, for example, in New Delhi or in South Africa, where I suppose you can definitely also see biopolitics at play, but in very different ways, I suppose, than you would see them, for example, in New York. So the idea is to kind of bring very local experiences and to bring kind of fieldwork experiences and the stories that anthropologists have about the context in which they conduct research into conversation with this concept, which is a bit more higher level, I suppose, and which can sometimes also work in a way to obscure some of the local contexts, because the pandemic didn't have an equal impact across the world. It was very different in London compared to the way it was in Amsterdam, for example, compared to the way it was in Johannesburg. So the idea is to kind of, I guess the PI of this project that I'm working with sometimes refers to it as burdening biopolitics with the world. So it's a kind of attempt to bring philosophy and anthropology in conversation with each other, to become more concerned with local realities and with actual stories and narratives, which I guess as anthropologists we're quite good at gathering. So that's really exciting. And yeah, I don't know, has it become a bit clearer, or yeah?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple of things that came to mind as you were talking about. One is, so in the previous episode, we had Ada Hassan speaking, who's sort of a scholar in international relations and global politics. And she was talking about the tensions between the discourse around global health and then that of national and international security, and how sometimes things that would be sort of put under the rubric or the discourse of global health actually, when push comes to shove, national securitization will be prioritized over that, but it will still be tried to be argued for under the guise of conversations about global health. And the other thing that came to mind is just, I think maybe one of the reasons why it's taken me some time to get my head around what biopolitics is it's so what I've just grown up with as like the rational norm, like of almost, well, of course we measure things, and of course we, particularly I guess going through medical school, it just almost feels like difficult to see differently because it's so just the water that I'm swimming in. But I think that I like the example of COVID because it does show, I guess, how it is it's a way of speaking and of kind of, I guess, almost like rationalizing one's decisions as a government, as a nation, or as a body, but not necessarily. It's not necessarily the water we're swimming in. Actually, so sometimes it is more of a it's more partial than that. So I really like this idea of burdening it with the world, of kind of coming to say, well, actually, it is. Yeah, how much does this speak to what we're seeing? So thank you.
I mean, I think one thing that's interesting is that it's not just something that works on a kind of national or government or policy level, but it's also something that you apply to yourself. So, I mean, also for the management of chronic disease, for example, but actually for anyone just in their daily lives, it's a kind of biopolitical framework kind of works on your the way that you manage yourself as an individual as well, like the guilt that you'll feel for not exercising, for example, or for not eating well enough, or kind of shame that you feel when you're being diagnosed with a certain condition that's considered or that has a certain stigma to it in a certain society. That's all kind of part of a certain biopolitics, I suppose. So it's just to say that it works on different levels. And in Foucault's later work, actually, he will be much more focused on how biopolitics works in the self and the kind of care of the self.
That's been really helpful, actually, to just get more of a sense of what the term is getting at, and really looking forward to seeing what comes out of the fascinating project that you're involved in now of burdening biopolitics with the world. That's fantastic. Well, Esca, thank you so much today for coming to join us and to speak on the podcast. It's been brilliant to hear from you about your work and to, I guess, bring to life these 3 ideas. And thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was wonderful talking to you about it. So, thank you.
And thank you everyone for listening in. You've been listening to the Thinking in Between podcast, and we'll be back again with another episode soon.